The last plant lineage that we are going to examine is the angiosperms. The angiosperms are our flowering plants, and these flowers are unique reproductive structures that have made this the most diverse lineage in the plant kingdom. We're going to see that flowers are ecologically important for a lot of organisms. Not that the others are not important in ecosystems, but once we get to angiosperms, we see a lot of interactions between animals and the plants that they are helping to reproduce. Our angiosperms are vascular plants. They are seed plants, and they derive from the gymnosperm lineage. The difference here is that we start to see flowers, we start to see fruit, and we start to see endosperm that has a slightly different origin than the endosperm in our gymnosperms. We won't go into a lot of detail in the angiosperm lineages. I like to put it up here because a lot of time people will recognize some of the plants, or they just really like to see pretty flowers. You don't need to know any of the distinguishing characteristics amongst the first 5. We'll talk very briefly about the last 2 lineages, the monocots and the eudicots, but we are not going to go into detail. About 65 million years ago, a massive asteroid hit the Earth in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. This event is called the Cretaceous Paleogene event, sometimes shortened to the KT event. And this asteroid caused a mass extinction of about 3/4 of the Earth's plant and animal species. This included all of our dinosaurs except for the ones in the bird lineage. And it caused a major shift in the type of plants and animals that were dominant on Earth. This asteroid kicked up huge amounts of smoke and ash that caused major environmental changes all around the Earth. Dust blocked sunlight, there was acid rain, there was rapid climate shifts, and this led to those widespread extinction. Many types of plants became extinct. After the KT event, we start to see a shift from our non-vascular plants. Our vascular plants. We're going to see a shift from our seed plants to our angiosperms. And then we are also going to see a shift in the type of animals that dominated. Most of the large animals were wiped out. The small mammals and birds were able to survive. Doesn't mean that everything was gone. There were small lineages that remained, but mammals were not wiped out because at the time mammals were small. They were evolved to nocturnal habits. They had big eyes. They burrowed underground, so they were largely protected and already adapted to these new conditions that were caused by the KT event. The sunlight was blocked by dust, ash, smoke, haze, all of that. This led first to plants dying, because if you can't get sunlight, you don't get photosynthesis. And then after that, the herbivores, and then finally the carnivores started to die out. So at the KT event, we start to see a shift in our plant life. Ferns dominated for a while, for a short amount of time, and they left a decent number of fossils, including fossilized spores. But the surviving groups of flowering plants began to diversify very, very quickly. Because of their seed and pollen adaptations, they were able to take up residence in places that were left vacant by our seedless vascular plants, and very quickly diversified. Angiosperms did really, really well because many insect lineages also survived, and they were able to diversify with those insects that were also exploring these new ecological spaces that were left due to extinction. Mammals usually rely directly or indirectly on the food produced by the angiosperms. And so as angiosperms diversified, the mammals diversified as well. So our angiosperms are different from the gymnosperms in that they have flowers, fruits, and special seed tissue called the endosperm. A flower is basically a fancy reproductive organ. It is there to attract pollinators to the flower, because within the flower are the ovules. Inside the flower is the ovary, and inside the ovary is the ovules. And the purpose of the flower is to attract pollinators to get pollen to the plant so that that pollen can fertilize the ovules. The fruit develops from the flower and is basically an enclosure for the seeds. They help with seed dispersal. They also help with a little bit of protection and nutrients when that seed is scattered. But generally, fruits are going to be there for dispersal of seeds by animals. The endosperm is a nutrient store that is housed around the little tiny plant embryo. In the center here, we have the plant embryo. When we go through this in lab, you'll see that the top part is the plumule, the bottom part is the radicle, but the whole thing is the embryo. And then it is covered by what we call a cotyledon, or a seed leaf. And then around that is the endosperm. This endosperm in angiosperms is the product of a special type of fertilization, and it is very nutrient rich. In fact, many of our staple crops are high in endosperm. So for example, this corn here has a lot of endosperm nutrients around it. Many of our other cereal crops also have large endosperm. So our angiosperm are the most diverse group of modern plants, with hundreds of thousands of species. They're so successful because they have unique new characteristics that were not found in any other plants. Basically, these are characteristics that take advantage of the animal life around them, the mammals, the insects, that diversified along with them after the KT event. So we see a lot of co-evolution between flowers, fruits, and animals or insects. Also unique to angiosperms are a structure called the vessels. These are water conducting cells. Vessels are not new. Vessels are found in the xylem, but the ones in angiosperms evolved to be wider and more efficient. So they're going to be better at moving water in terrestrial environments. Angiosperms also have more densely branching vascular system. So this is going to allow for more leaves and branching structures off of the main stem. So flowers are really just fancy reproductive structures. They are specialized in producing pollen or seeds and then attracting pollinators to them. There are 4 organs on the flowers. We'll start down at the bottom. The sepal is basically a leaf that covers the flower. So if you think of a rosebud before it opens up, those little green leaves around the bud, that is the sepal. And when the flower opens up, they kind of are down at the bottom near the base of the flower. The petals are specialized leaves. Their job is to attract pollinators. So even though they're leaves, their job's not photosynthesis, their job is reproductive. They're brightly colored. Sometimes they have patterns, but their goal is to get insects to them. They're often flashy colors. Many of them have UV pigments, so the colors are a little bit different under UV light, and that's because some insects see the UV spectrum that we don't see, and so they might be attracted by particular UV colors. Basically, the petals are just full of pigments. Whatever color that plant has evolved, it's got pigments in their plastids. So they're super, super colorful leaves filled with pigment-containing plastids. The stamens are the male part of the reproductive system. They are made up of two parts. The filament, which is going to raise the anther way up high. That anther is where the pollen is produced, and so their job is to get that pollen up higher than the rest of the flower so that it can be more easily dispersed. In the center, we have the female reproductive structures. Generally, this structure is called the pistil. We'll talk about that more on the next page. And then inside of the pistil, we have a region called the carpels. The carpel is where we produce the ovule. Now, this is a relatively simple flower. We can have more complex carpels, we can have more complex ovule structures, we can have more complex pistil structures. But you just need to know this basic structure with the anther and filament around the outside and the pistil with the carpels on the inside. This image shows our pistil with the carpel on the inside. As I mentioned a minute ago, the flower can be more complex. We can have multiple carpels inside the pistil. This is just showing one. The pistil has a stigma up on top. The stigma is the location of the pollen or receptor. I don't know that receptor is the best word, but it's the place where the pollen is going to land. So we're going to get a little piece of pollen here. And that pollen is going to land on the stigma. The center is called the style. It's long and thin to get that up nice and high so that pollen can more easily land on that structure. Down below is the ovary. The ovary contains the ovule. The ovule is the equivalent of an egg, so it is the female gametophyte. I'm sorry, the female gamete. Inside the ovary is an embryo sac. So what's going to happen is this pollen is going to germinate. It's going to grow a little tube down into the ovule, and it is going to fertilize the ovule. And then that is going to grow into the embryo. Remember that we are in the seed plants, so that embryo is going to grow into the seed. And that seed is going to be protected in a fruit. So this is a new development. That seed, that embryo, is going to be protected inside the ovary, but the ovary is going to become the fruit, and that fruit is going to help with dispersion of the seed plant. Sorry, the seed part of the plant. In just a second, we're going to talk about alternation of generations for angiosperms. It's really similar to the pine alternation of generations, but there are a couple of key things that are different. One is that the pollen tube actually delivers 2 sperm. So if this is our pollen, there are 2 sperm in there, which means there are 2 nuclei. When that pollen germinates, it's going to grow down and fertilize an ovary. That ovary is going to, or I'm sorry, inside the ovary there's an ovule. That ovule is going to grow into the fertilized seed. But we have two sperm there. This is called double fertilization. One of the sperm nuclei is going to go and fertilize that ovule. The other is essentially going to fertilize the area around the ovule and form the endosperm. This is slightly different than in our pine plants. We don't have this double fertilization. The endosperm is still that storage of nutrients, but the endosperm in our flowering plants is just a little bit different because it is fertilized by that second sperm. In general, our angiosperm alternation of generations is going to be similar to the gymnosperm generations. The main difference is that the gametophyte is going to be protected inside a flower. So if we follow our cycle on this alternation of generations map, we've got our sporophyte. On that sporophyte, we have the anther that is going to produce our pollen. Our pollen is inside these microspores. Remember that pollen is going to be our gametophyte, and the gamete is going to be enclosed inside that spore. So if we follow the male line, those microspores produce pollen grains by meiosis. That pollen grain is eventually going to find a stigma, and two sperm inside that pollen grain are going to fertilize this ovule in this flower. If we go over here to our ovules, we've got our ovule, or our ovary, containing the megasporangium. Inside is the egg, the megaspore. Remember that inside the spore we've got the female gametophyte, which means we have the egg. The megasporangium is going to divide into that female gamete, and that gamete is going to be fertilized by our pollen. So we've got that integument again around the outside of our female egg. Inside we've got the egg, and here at the very bottom we have got the double fertilization by our sperm. And from our previous slide we saw that one of those sperm is going to fertilize the egg, the other is going to fertilize the endosperm. The endosperm is actually triploid, meaning it has an extra set of nuclei. Then we've got the zygote there in the center. That's going to be our fertilized egg. You can see the pollen tube coming in, fertilizing that egg. From there, we get our endosperm surrounding our embryo inside of our seed, and then that seed is going to be protected inside our fruit. I would suggest that you follow through these steps real quick, take some notes on this cycle, and make sure that you know how it's different from the gymnosperm alternation of generations. Remember, you should know the difference between moss to fern, fern to gymnosperm, gymnosperm to angiosperm. All right, finally, within our angiosperm lineage, we have some specific groups that we're going to talk about, but we're only going to talk about them very, very briefly. These are our most recent diverging plants, the monocots and the eudicots. They are named for differences in their seed leaf, the cotyledon. Monocots have one cotyledon. Eudicots sometimes shortened to dicot, meaning two, have two seed leaves around their embryo. And then, of course, that embryo grows into the early plant. The cotyledon eventually kind of goes away as it is replaced by true leaves from the plumule. Monocots typically have petals, stamens, and flower parts in multiples of 3. So we've got an example up here of a daffodil. Down here on the bottom, we've got some multiples of 4s and 5s. So we've got this little flower here. Not quite sure what this one is. We have a couple examples here. We've got daffodils, irises, and tulips as our monocots. You can see some other differences. We've got the one cotyledon in the seed. Our root structure, vascular system are a little bit different. Our leaf structures are just a little bit different. When we do our lab about plant tissues, you'll learn a little bit more about these different structures. Down on the bottom, we've got our dicots. Some examples are snapdragons, daisies. I should have known that. I recognize it now. And then roses are another example. Of course, we've got the two cotyledons in the seed. Their root structure is a little bit different. Vascular system's a little bit different. Leaves are a little bit different as well. And as I mentioned, once we get to that tissue lab, you'll learn a little bit more about these. You'll look at examples of the vascular systems of these different plants. All right, so finally we get to our flowers and our pollinators. Many flowers have special tube-like structures that accumulate nectar. So this nectar is just a sugary substance that is going to attract many of our pollinators, including our hummingbirds and bats, rodents, etc. Many of our pollinators are very intimately involved with the flowers that they work to pollinate. So we have, for example, this hummingbird with its long, thin beak and these long, thin flower tubes. That's to ensure that the right pollinator is getting to this flower. And it also ensures that the pollen from this flower is going to go to another flower of the same type, because the pollinator prefers a particular type of plant. So the benefit here is that the pollinator is going to receive that nectar. It's sort of its reward for getting pollen all over itself. And then when it goes to the next plant, it's going to transfer that pollen over. Once that pollen reaches the ovule, it's going to grow into the fertilized zygote and then become the embryo. Remember that in our seed plants, the embryo is formed within the seed and then surrounded by the endosperm for nutrients. In our angiosperms, we have the unique adaptation of fruit. So the fruit is going to develop from the ovary. It's going to surround the seeds, and the fruits are basically there to aid in dispersal of the seeds. So for example, many fruits are eaten by wild animals. The seed with its protective coating passes through the digestive system and then is pooped out into an environment. When this happens, it basically comes with its own fertilizer. So that flesh of the seed is there to basically attract animals to eat it and disperse those seeds. There's a whole variety of different types of fruit. We've got some examples here and some of the different types of fruit adaptations. We're not going to go into too many of the details about the fruit, but just keep in mind that many of the foods that we eat are actually fruits, and that fruit's goal is to disperse the seed. Some of our fruits are not what we would call fruits. They're sort of rough structures like our dandelion here or this burr here. And then some of our fruits are things we don't think about so much, like a coconut. It's basically a giant fruit. So just keep in mind that fruits are this fabulous new development that, along with pollinators and flowers, are going to aid in that massive spread of angiosperms to make our angiosperms the most diverse group of land plants.